My family tried to steal my inheritance, but I fought back to keep what was rightfully mine.
Hey Reddit, I'm Leo, 29, and I've always been the quiet, overlooked one in my family. I've spent most of my life trying to please people who would never be satisfied, constantly bending over backward for my parents and siblings while they treated me like an afterthought. Recently, my grandfather passed away and, to everyone's surprise, including mine, he left me a significant inheritance. It felt like a blessing, but as soon as my family found out, they turned on me. They've been doing everything they can to persuade, guilt trip, and manipulate me into giving up the money. Here's the story of how I fought back to keep what my grandfather wanted me to have. I grew up in a large, loud, and overbearing family. My parents, Frank and Linda, were always busy, my dad with his small business that was constantly on the brink of bankruptcy and my mom trying to keep the house running while managing all of us kids. I'm the middle child sandwiched between my older sister, Emma, 33, and my younger brother, Ethan, 26. From an early age, it was clear that Emma was the golden child and Ethan was the baby of the family who could do no wrong, leaving me to fill the role of the invisible one. Emma was always the star, top grades, varsity athlete, and the one who everyone expected to do great things. My parents doted on her, constantly praising her achievements and making sure she had every opportunity.
Emma seemed destined for success from the start, and her every move was celebrated. Whether it was winning the school science fair or getting into her dream college, our parents acted like her accomplishments were their own. They'd beam with pride, showing off her trophies and awards to anyone who'd listen. I'd often stand in the background, clapping politely, knowing that my own achievements would never be met with the same enthusiasm. Ethan, on the other hand, was the rebel, the charming, reckless kid who could sweet-talk his way out of anything. He was the kind of brother who would skip school, get caught with a fake ID, and still manage to flash a grin that would melt my parents' anger. Ethan could do no wrong, even when he was clearly in the wrong.
He had a magnetic personality that everyone seemed to forgive, including my parents, who would constantly bail him out of his latest trouble with the law or school. They'd excuse his behavior as boys being boys, and every time he screwed up, they'd rush to fix it, shielding him from any real consequences. Meanwhile, I was the one who slipped through the cracks. I wasn't as impressive as Emma or as troublesome as Ethan, so I became the quiet, responsible one who didn't cause waves. I did well in school, but my achievements were never celebrated the way Emma's were. I stayed out of trouble, but unlike Ethan, I never got credit for it. Instead, I was expected to handle things on my own, to be self-sufficient, and to never ask for help. My parents' focus was always elsewhere, and I grew up feeling like an afterthought. One time, I remember getting straight A's on my report card and nervously handing it to my parents, hoping for some recognition. My mom glanced at it briefly, nodding with a distracted "good job, Leo," before quickly shifting her attention back to Ethan, who was showing off his latest video game high score.
My dad didn't even look up from his newspaper.
It was like no matter how hard I tried, I was invisible, a supporting character in a drama that was always centered around my siblings.
Despite the lack of attention from my parents, I always had one person who believed in me, my grandfather, Henry.
Grandpa Henry was my dad's father, a quiet but wise man who lived just a few blocks away from us. He wasn't flashy or overly affectionate, but he had a way of making me feel seen. Whenever I felt overwhelmed by the noise and chaos of my family, I'd bike over to Grandpa's house, where he'd be waiting on his porch with a glass of lemonade and a story about the good old days.
Grandpa Henry was a retired accountant who had worked hard all his life.
He was the type of person who saved every penny, invested wisely, and lived modestly despite having a comfortable amount of wealth. He wasn't the kind of grandfather who showered us with expensive gifts or lavish trips, but he always made time for me. He taught me how to fish, helped me with my math homework, and was the first person to encourage me to pursue a degree in finance, a decision that shaped my future.
Grandpa Henry's house was my refuge, a place where I didn't have to compete for attention.
I remember the quiet afternoons we spent together, sitting on his back porch while he told me about his days working in the city, the challenges he faced, and the satisfaction he got from figuring out complex financial puzzles. He had a subtle, dry sense of humor and would often slip life lessons into his stories, teaching me about the importance of hard work, patience, and saving for the future. While my parents were busy with their own lives, Grandpa was there for all the little moments that mattered. He came to my school recitals when no one else did, slipped me extra cash when I was struggling in college,
and always offered a listening ear when I needed to vent about my family. He never judged, never compared me to my siblings, and always made me feel like I was enough. Whenever I felt lost or invisible, Grandpa would look me in the eye and say, "Leo, you've got something special. Don't ever let anyone make you feel otherwise." I clung to those words, especially during the difficult times when my family's neglect felt unbearable. My parents, on the other hand, barely noticed my existence most of the time. My dad was too wrapped up in his failing business, always complaining about how hard things were and how nobody appreciated his sacrifices. He'd spend hours venting about his financial struggles, blaming everyone from the economy to his unreliable employees, but he never took responsibility for his own poor decisions. My mom was obsessed with keeping up appearances, making sure Emma had the best of everything and that Ethan's latest screw-up could be brushed under the rug. I was the quiet one, the dependable one, the one who they only paid attention to when they needed something done. Even when I graduated college with a degree in finance, my parents were lukewarm in their congratulations. My dad muttered something about how Emma did it first, and my mom was more concerned about the cost of the ceremony than the fact that I'd made it through 4 years of hard work. It stung, but by then, I was used to being overlooked. I had learned not to expect too much from my family, and that was fine with me. But my relationship with Grandpa Henry was different. He was genuinely proud of me. He'd tell me stories about his own struggles when he was my age, how he'd built his career from nothing, the mistakes he'd made along the way, and the lessons he'd learned about money and life. He was the only person who seemed to understand my drive, my desire to be more than just the invisible middle child. He'd always say, "Leo, you've got a good head on your shoulders. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." When Grandpa Henry passed away earlier this year, it hit me hard. He was 84 and had lived a full life, but losing him felt like losing the one person in my family who truly saw me. The funeral was a small, somber affair, and I spent most of it standing by his casket, trying to hold back tears while my parents and siblings exchanged shallow condolences. They treated it like a chore, another obligation to check off their list before returning to their own lives. It was as if none of them realized what we had lost, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was more alone than ever. A few weeks after the funeral, I received a call from my grandfather's lawyer. He explained that Grandpa Henry had left me something in his will and that I needed to come to his office to discuss it. I was surprised. Grandpa had never mentioned anything about his will, and I assumed that whatever he had would go to my dad or be split among the family. I didn't think much of it and figured it was probably a few keepsakes or maybe some of his old books that he knew I liked. When I arrived at the lawyer's office, I was nervous but curious. The lawyer, Mr. Thompson, was a kind, older man who had known my grandfather for years. His office was filled with leather-bound books, old photos, and the faint scent of tobacco, relics of a bygone era. He greeted me warmly and handed me a copy of the will. As I read through the legal jargon, my eyes widened. Grandpa Henry had left me his entire estate, his house, his savings, and a significant amount of money invested in stocks and bonds. Altogether, it was worth nearly $1 million. I sat there, stunned. I knew Grandpa had lived frugally, but I had no idea he had this kind of wealth. He had always been so unassuming, never flaunting his money or making a big deal out of it. And now, he had left it all to me. Mr. Thompson explained that Grandpa had set up the will years ago and had never changed it. "He always said you were the one who deserved it," the lawyer told me, his voice soft. "He was very proud of you." A flood of emotions washed over me: shock, gratitude, and an overwhelming sense of responsibility. This was more money than I had ever imagined having, and it felt like a validation of everything Grandpa had ever told me. He believed in me, even when no one else did, and now he was giving me a chance to build the life I'd always dreamed of. But as much as I was grateful, I was also terrified. I knew that this kind of money would change everything, and I wasn't sure I was ready for what was to come. As I walked out of the lawyer's office, clutching the will in my hand, my mind was spinning. I thought about all the ways this inheritance could change my life: paying off my student loans, buying a home, investing in my future. But I also knew that this kind of money could attract the worst in people, especially in a family like mine, where resentment and jealousy were always simmering beneath the surface. When I told my parents about the inheritance, their reaction was not what I expected. I had hoped they'd be happy for me, maybe even a little proud. But instead, they were stunned, almost offended. My dad's face turned red, and my mom looked like she'd just been slapped. "He left everything to you?" my dad asked, disbelief and anger lacing his words. "Why would he do that?" I tried to explain that Grandpa had always supported me, that he saw something in me, but my parents were having none of it. My mom immediately started speculating that there must have been some mistake, that the lawyer had misread the will. "Your grandfather was old," she said, as if that explained everything. "He probably didn't know what he was doing." Emma and Ethan, who were there when I broke the news, were equally shocked. Emma, who had always been the golden child, couldn't hide her resentment. "You're not even the eldest," she scoffed. "It makes no sense." She tried to mask her frustration, but I could see the envy flickering in her eyes. She had always been the one who was supposed to succeed, and this inheritance felt like a disruption of the family narrative she'd grown accustomed to. Ethan, ever the opportunist, tried to hide his jealousy with a thin smile, but I could tell he was already plotting how he could benefit from this windfall. He was pacing around the room, throwing out ideas about how the money could be used to help the family, and I could see the gears turning in his head. He didn't care about Grandpa's wishes, he just saw dollar signs. The whole room turned tense, and I felt like a stranger in my own family. Instead of celebrating with me, they were treating me like an intruder who had stolen something from them. My dad stormed off, muttering about how unfair it was, while my mom grilled me about every detail, asking if I was sure there wasn't some way the will could be contested. I left their house that night feeling more isolated than ever, the weight of my grandfather's gift suddenly feeling like a burden. It didn't take long for my family to start their campaign to get their hands on my inheritance. The calls began almost immediately. My mom would ring me up multiple times a day, each time with a new angle. First, it was concern. "Leo, you've never managed this kind of money before. It's a lot of responsibility," she'd say, her tone dripping with feigned worry. "Maybe your dad and I could help you manage it." I politely declined, assuring her that I was capable of handling it on my own. I had a degree in finance, after all, and I was more than familiar with investment strategies. But my mom didn't back down. She started to push harder, insisting that I consult with her and my dad before making any decisions. She brought up their experience with money, conveniently ignoring the fact that they were constantly in debt and struggling to keep their business afloat. "Leo, we've been through this before," she'd say, her voice dripping with condescension. "We know what it's like to manage money. You're young, and you don't want to make any mistakes." She'd go on and on about how my dad's business knowledge could help me make the right choices, conveniently skipping over all the failed ventures and mounting debts he'd accumulated over the years. My dad, never one to be subtle, went straight for the guilt trip. He called me one night, his voice tinged with bitterness. "You know, Leo, your grandfather helped me start my business. Without him, none of this would have been possible," he said, as if that somehow meant I owed him something. "It doesn't feel right that you keep all that money when we're the ones who really need it." I tried to keep my cool, reminding him that Grandpa had made his wishes clear and that this was his way of taking care of me. But my dad wasn't having it. He accused me of being selfish, of not appreciating everything they'd done for me. "We're family," he said angrily. "And family shares." Emma and Ethan were no better. Emma, who had always been the overachiever, took a different approach. She tried to play the role of the concerned sister, suggesting that I wasn't thinking about the bigger picture. She went on and on about how I could use the money to help the family, how it could be invested in my dad's business, or how it could pay off their mortgage and put Ethan through school. She painted it all as a selfless, noble act, conveniently ignoring the fact that it would leave me with nothing. "Leo, you don't understand," she'd say, leaning into her role as the family spokesperson. "This isn't just about you. It's about all of us. You have a chance to make a difference in this family, to do something meaningful." But I knew her concern wasn't genuine, it was about maintaining the power dynamic that had always favored her. Ethan, true to form, was the most blatant. He called me up, not even bothering with pretense. "Bro, you gotta help me out," he said casually. "I've got this amazing business idea, but I just need a little capital to get started." He spun a tale about a tech startup he wanted to launch, complete with buzzwords and grand promises of success.
When I told him I wasn't interested, he switched tactics, accusing me of being stingy and reminding me of all the times he'd had my back growing up. The truth was, Ethan had never had my back. He'd spent our entire childhood making my life difficult, from stealing my toys to tattling on me whenever it suited him. He was a master manipulator, always finding ways to make himself look like the victim. And now, here he was, trying to guilt-trip me into handing over the money that my grandfather had left me. It was infuriating, but it also reinforced what I'd always known deep down: my family didn't see me as a person. They saw me as a resource, a means to an end. The constant pressure was overwhelming. Every time my phone buzzed, I felt a surge of anxiety, knowing it was likely another attempt to manipulate me. I started avoiding family gatherings, unwilling to subject myself to the endless barrage of questions, guilt trips, and thinly veiled demands. My parents, sensing that they were losing their grip, escalated their tactics, bringing in other relatives to persuade me. My Aunt Karen, who I hadn't spoken to in years, suddenly reappeared in my life, feigning interest in my well-being. "Leo, sweetie, I heard about the inheritance," she said during one of her unexpected visits. "It's such a blessing, but you have to be careful. Money can tear families apart." Her words were dripping with insincerity, and I could see right through her. She wasn't there out of concern, she was there to reinforce my parents' narrative, to make me feel like I was the one being unreasonable. I felt trapped. No matter where I turned, someone was trying to convince me to give up what was rightfully mine. I began to question myself, wondering if I was being selfish for wanting to keep the money. I knew that my family wasn't entitled to it, but their relentless pressure was starting to wear me down. The inheritance, which had initially felt like a gift from my grandfather, was quickly becoming a source of stress and division. My family's manipulation tactics only grew more intense as time went on. They shifted from guilt-tripping to outright emotional blackmail, and it became clear that they would stop at nothing to get what they wanted. My mom, always the master of passive-aggressive behavior, started spreading rumors within the family about how I was hoarding the money and refusing to help those in need. I'd get calls from distant relatives, people I hadn't spoken to in years, asking why I was being so selfish. My cousin Jenna, who had always been close with Emma, called me out of the blue to lecture me about family values. "We're all struggling, Leo," she said in a condescending tone. "Your parents have done so much for you. The least you could do is give back." It was exhausting. No matter how many times I tried to explain that the money was meant for me, that Grandpa had left it to me for a reason, they twisted my words, making me out to be the villain. My parents even went as far as to suggest that I was dishonoring Grandpa's memory by not sharing the inheritance. "He would have wanted you to help us," my mom would say, her eyes welling up with fake tears. "He loved this family." But the truth was, Grandpa had left the money to me because he knew what my family was like. He'd seen how they treated me, how they overlooked me, dismissed me, and only paid attention when they needed something. He knew I was the responsible one, the one who would use the money wisely, and that's why he'd made the decision to leave it all to me. But trying to explain that to my family was like talking to a brick wall. My dad, growing increasingly desperate, tried a different approach. One night, he called me over to his house under the guise of having a man-to-man talk. I reluctantly agreed, hoping that maybe he'd finally understand my perspective. But as soon as I walked through the door, I knew it was a setup. My dad was sitting at the kitchen table with a stack of paperwork, a grim look on his face. "Leo, I've been crunching the numbers, and things are bad," he said, sliding the papers toward me. They were bank statements, showing just how deep in debt his business was. He painted a bleak picture of how they were on the verge of losing everything: their house, the business, everything they'd worked for. He looked at me with pleading eyes. "We need help, son. This is about saving the family." I felt my heart sink. I knew things had been rough for my parents, but seeing the extent of their financial troubles was overwhelming. My dad laid it on thick, talking about how hard he'd worked to provide for us, how he'd sacrificed everything for the family. It was an emotional appeal, one designed to make me feel guilty, to make me feel like I was responsible for their mess. "I can't, Dad," I said quietly, pushing the papers back. "This money isn't for that. Grandpa left it to me for a reason." My dad's expression hardened. "So you're just going to let us lose everything?" he snapped.
After everything we've done for you?" It was like a switch had flipped. The pleading had turned into anger, and I could see the resentment simmering just beneath the surface. He was furious that I wasn't falling in line, that I wasn't playing the role of the dutiful son who would sacrifice his own future for theirs. I stood my ground, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm sorry, but I have to think about my own future. This money is my chance to build something for myself." My dad scoffed, shaking his head in disgust. "You're just like your grandfather, selfish. He never cared about this family, and neither do you." I left their house that night feeling drained and defeated. No matter how many times I explained my position, it fell on deaf ears. My family didn't want to understand, they just wanted what they felt they were owed, and they were willing to do anything to get it. The emotional toll was immense. I found myself questioning everything, feeling torn between the desire to honor my grandfather's wishes and the constant pressure from my family. I started losing sleep, my mind racing with the guilt they'd heaped on me. I felt like I was being pulled in 100 different directions, with no one in my corner. As the pressure from my family reached its peak, I realized that I couldn't keep living like this. I had to make a choice, to either cave into their demands and sacrifice my future, or to stand my ground and honor what my grandfather had left me. I knew it wouldn't be easy, but I also knew that if I didn't set boundaries now, my family would never stop. I reached out to Mr. Thompson, my grandfather's lawyer, and asked for his advice. He was supportive, reassuring me that I had every right to keep the inheritance and that my family had no legal claim to it. "Your grandfather was very clear about his intentions, Leo," he said firmly. "This money was meant for you. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." With his guidance, I took steps to protect my inheritance. I set up a trust fund and put measures in place to ensure that my family couldn't access the money. It was a difficult decision, but it was necessary. I couldn't afford to let their greed jeopardize my future. I also made the decision to go low contact with my family. I needed space to breathe, to think, and to focus on my own life without the constant barrage of guilt and manipulation. It was hard. I missed the occasional moments of normalcy, the family dinners that weren't tainted by hidden agendas. But I knew that this was the only way to regain control. My family, of course, didn't take it well. My mom called me in tears, accusing me of abandoning them and of letting money change who I was. My dad, still seething, sent me a long-winded email about how disappointed he was, how I was betraying the family, and how Grandpa had always been out to get him. It was clear that they were projecting their own insecurities, their own failures, onto me, and I refused to let it dictate my actions any longer. Emma and Ethan tried to guilt-trip me from a different angle. Emma sent me long messages about how family should stick together, conveniently glossing over all the times she'd ignored me or treated me like an afterthought. Ethan, ever the manipulator, tried to play the sympathy card, telling me that I was ruining his chances of success by not investing in his latest business idea. But their words no longer held the power they once did. For the first time, I started investing in myself. I used part of the inheritance to pay off my student loans, giving me the financial freedom I'd never had before. I bought a small condo, nothing flashy, but a place I could call my own, away from the toxic environment I'd grown up in. I put the rest of the money into investments, just as Grandpa had taught me, ensuring that I could build a stable future for myself. I also took some time to honor Grandpa in my own way. I donated a portion of the inheritance to a local charity that he had supported, a small gesture to keep his legacy alive. It felt good to give back, to use his gift to make a positive impact, and it reminded me of all the lessons he'd taught me about generosity, responsibility, and doing what was right, even when it was hard. But as much as I tried to move on, the emotional scars left by my family lingered. There were days when I'd feel overwhelming guilt, wondering if I was doing the right thing by keeping my distance. I'd think about all the times I'd been there for them, all the times I'd put their needs above my own, and it was hard to accept that they'd never do the same for me. I found solace in therapy, something I'd started shortly after Grandpa's death. My therapist helped me unpack the years of resentment, the feelings of inadequacy, and the pain of being constantly overlooked. She reminded me that setting boundaries didn't make me selfish, it made me strong. "You're allowed to protect yourself, Leo," she told me. "You're allowed to put yourself first." Slowly but surely, I started to rebuild my life. I focused on my career, poured my energy into my work, and surrounded myself with people who supported me for who I was, not for what I could give them. I reconnected with old friends, picked up new hobbies, and found joy in the simple things that I'd missed out on while trying to please everyone else. As time went on, I learned to let go of the guilt that my family had burdened me with. I realized that I couldn't control their reactions or their sense of entitlement, but I could control how I responded. I stopped answering their manipulative calls, stopped engaging in their drama, and focused on creating a life that made me happy. One day, I received an unexpected letter from Emma. It was long and rambling, filled with apologies and justifications for her behavior. She admitted that she'd been jealous, that she'd always felt the need to compete for our parents' approval, and that she was sorry for how she'd treated me. It wasn't a perfect apology, she still made excuses, still tried to downplay her actions, but it was a start. I wrote back, thanking her for reaching out and expressing my hope that we could one day rebuild our relationship. But I was clear that it would take time, and that I wasn't willing to compromise my boundaries. Emma seemed to understand, and while things between us are still strained, there's a sense of mutual respect that wasn't there before. Ethan, predictably, hasn't changed. He's still chasing get-rich-quick schemes and blaming everyone else for his failures. I've had to accept that some people never change, and that it's okay to walk away from relationships that are toxic, even if they're family. My parents, too, remain distant. We exchange the occasional polite message, but the closeness that I once longed for is no longer a priority. Despite everything, I've found peace in knowing that I made the right decision. I've used my inheritance to build a life that I'm proud of, a life that honors my grandfather's memory and his faith in me. I'm no longer the overlooked middle child, defined by my family's expectations and judgments. I'm my own person, and I finally feel free. I've also made it a point to give back in small ways, whether it's through volunteering, mentoring young people in my field, or supporting causes that matter to me. It's my way of keeping Grandpa's spirit alive, of paying forward the kindness and wisdom he showed me. Final update, reclaiming my life. Hey Reddit, it's Leo again. It's been a long, challenging journey, but I've finally found my footing. My family's attempts to take my inheritance were a wake-up call, forcing me to re-evaluate my relationships and prioritize my own well-being. I've set boundaries, cut ties where necessary, and learned to stand up for myself in ways I never thought possible. My grandfather's gift was more than just money, it was a reminder that I am worth fighting for, that I deserve to live a life free from manipulation and guilt. I'm no longer weighed down by my family's expectations, and I'm no longer afraid to put myself first. To anyone dealing with family pressure, guilt trips, or toxic dynamics, know that you have the right to protect your peace. You don't owe anyone your happiness, and it's okay to say no. You are not defined by what others think of you, and you deserve to live life on your own terms. Thanks for reading, and here's to reclaiming our lives, one step at a time.